In every way possible, Jesus was a terrible Messiah. Hi, welcome to our YouTube channel here at Mudline Church of the Nazarene and our ongoing series entitled The First Book. We are doing a study on the book of Galatians, and we're calling it the first book because this is the first chronological book of the New Testament. It was written earlier than any other, probably around 48 AD. Now, I have to go back a little bit just in case you missed some of the previous episodes. We talked about last time that the book of Galatians really is at its heart a public defense speech. And the key part of that speech is something called the propositio, which in this case is Galatians 2, verses 15 and 16. We are justified not by observing the works of the law, but through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. So that is the basic premise that Paul is arguing. When you get to chapter 3, you enter into a section of the speech called the probatio, and that's just all the arguments or the evidence for your thesis statement. And that's where Paul is. I want to be further our talk in Galatians chapter 3. Start with verse 10. And starting in verse 10, Paul really does an Old Testament tour de force with a number of direct quotations from the Old Testament. He starts off by saying, all who rely on observing the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. Clearly, no one is justified before God by the law, because the righteous will live by faith. So he just went from a section of Deuteronomy 27, and he ended up in Habakkuk chapter 2, the righteous will live by faith. Now, there's a couple things here. That first statement about all who rely on observing the law. Now, in our day, I think we don't understand what this phrase means. We think it means legalism, that people who follow the rules in order to feel good about how they live. That's our battle. That wasn't Paul's battle. In Paul's day, the issue was different. Jews thought that they were the chosen people, and they were. And so the key then is how do you determine who the chosen people are? Well, they're those who act like Jews. No Jew ever in the first century kept the rules in order to qualify for anything. No Jew ever earned their salvation. That's language from today. They merely demonstrated that they were part of the chosen people by their life. So observing the law meant they didn't eat pork. They wore clothing made of just one material. They didn't eat shellfish. They didn't mix the meat with the milk of its mother. So like a bacon double cheeseburger, that's like two Jewish food laws at once. They kept the law in order to stay in, not to get in or to earn their way. So Paul right away is saying, you do not get a special inside track just by claiming your status as a Jew. And it says, starting in verse 13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. Well, what is that curse? Well, the curse is that I think all of us at some point in life find ourselves having fallen short. There's some premise where we find that we didn't keep it perfectly. Again, it's not a matter of earning, but a matter of status. And so that's the curse. Well, if you didn't do everything, it doesn't matter if you do 999 good things and then the one time you fail. Well, Paul is bringing up these Old Testament verses to say, hey, you're still cursed. You have failed. And then he goes on. Not only Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, and now he quotes from Deuteronomy 21, cursed is everyone who was hung on a tree. That's out of Deuteronomy 21:23. He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. There's two very important thoughts here, and I'm going to spend most of our time with those two. The first one is this idea, cursed is everyone who's hung on a tree. This breaks every concept of what the Jews thought the Messiah would be. They thought military ruler, they thought government official, they thought someone who would defeat Rome, set up his earthly kingdom. And in Deuteronomy it says, if you're hung on a tree, you're cursed. So the minute that Jesus gets put on a cross, there are many things he can be. Failed revolutionary. He can be a common criminal or thief. But he can't be the Messiah. In every way possible, Jesus was a terrible Messiah. He fulfilled none of the expectations. He was not a ruler. And so you have this failed in every way, shape, or form. You have people today saying, wait a minute, this Christianity thing is kind of a ruse. What happened is it's impossible. No one rises from the dead. So these disciples, they just wanted to start a new movement, or they had a collective experience and they held up this Jesus as someone that he's not. Well, here's the problem with that. If a group of Jews were going to start a new religion or to start some new effort around the idea that someone was the Messiah, the last person they would have picked would have been anyone who was hung on a cross. The last person they would have picked is anyone who would have made all the decisions Jesus did. He didn't start a military insurrection. He never tried to start an earthly government. He never dealt in power. But he took on all the weight and just piled it all on himself, and he willingly went to the cross. No one, and I mean no one, would have ever thought of Jesus as the Messiah until he rose again. This is actually one of the proofs that there's something here. No one would have put any weight behind a failed leader like that. And this last bit of 3:14, when it says that so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. Paul had given his whole life to following the law and upholding the law. And whatever happened to him on that road to Damascus, it was so real, and it had nothing to do with the law that he'd given his life following. So he had to reorder his entire world. What was the reality to him now? He'd searched his whole life to have this intimate relationship with God, and the law didn't lead him there. But now he had it, and what happened? He had to think and went, wait a minute, let's go back to the book of Joel, chapter 2. In the last days, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. That's what he experienced. And that's what he saw with the Gentiles as well. And Paul reordered his whole world and said, wait a minute, perhaps the law was not what we thought it was. Perhaps it's not the goal. It never should have been. Perhaps the goal all along is that we might be filled with his Spirit, not follow words on a written code. And so because of his experience in Damascus Road, because of his ministry now among the Gentiles, seeing the exact same thing happen to them that happened to him, Paul reorders his whole world, his whole theology, and says, wait a minute, the book of Joel was right. The book of Jeremiah was right. The book of Ezekiel was right. It was here all along. Habakkuk 2 was right. The righteous will live by faith. And in the end, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. And this is where Paul finds himself in chapter 3. And looking back and saying, wait a minute, this was really a failed experiment by all means. A Messiah would not hang on a tree. No one would view him as a Messiah unless there was a resurrection. And the same law that condemned Jesus because he hung on a tree, the same law that condemned him to death, now is no longer in force. And that's the good news. Thanks for joining us. We're going to go further in chapter 3 next week. There's a lot here. There's a lot to unpack. I could spend weeks here. I won't. I'd bore you to death. But look forward to you coming back and joining us next week. We'll see you then.